Hello, my dear friends. How have you been? I'm Mari Theriger, and today I'm going to briefly talk about the evolution of magic in Scandinavia. Just a few general aspects to easily understand the structure of Scandinavian folk magic in relation to witchcraft, sorcery, folk magic in general, and Trolldom. I'll start by addressing the case of cultural identity, and then I shall proceed into the evolution of folk magic in Scandinavia, perhaps not as you are expecting it to be, but following the case of cultural identity, it is important to understand that folk magic and folk traditions in general in Scandinavia or any other region and countries are the product of several interactions throughout history, exchanges between different cultures and peoples. So it's very important to understand this so we might understand the core of folk traditions and why they are so rich and diverse. I'm doing this video because I've been receiving many similar questions precisely in relation to Scandinavian folk magic and tradition as to why several non-Scandinavian religious and traditional folklore conceptions appear in Scandinavian magic. There's a lot of people who either do not feel comfortable or have doubts or are even unable to accept, for instance, as an example, Judeo-Christian religious ideas in Scandinavian witchcraft and traditional folk magic. Why does that happen? As an example, why Scandinavian folk magic has a lot of invocations and evocations towards Christ and the Christian God, or even Judeo-Christian demons and saints, alongside Norse gods and other gods and entities, and a great mixture of ideas and the devil and so on and so forth. And I find it very interesting, the meaning behind these questions and doubts, because when we speak about Scandinavian culture, most people will immediately point out the Vikings or the Norse culture without hesitation. So there's automatically a formulation of a thought that Scandinavian culture is only related to a specific period in history, a specific culture, and so it is assumed that it's all about the Norse gods and Norse paganism and the Viking Age and the Viking Age religious symbols, mythology, and so on and so forth. The truth is, as obvious as it is, there's more to Scandinavia than just the Vikings or the Norse culture or the Norse mythology. As you know, the Vikings were not a people, but a profession, a way of life. As I usually say, not every medieval Scandinavian was a Viking, but many Vikings were Scandinavians. The Viking Age constitutes only one small fraction of history and a particular cultural aspect in a very small time span in the whole of Scandinavian history, which is why the great majority of modern Scandinavians are sick and tired of the Viking Age, because that's what most people speak about and neglect all the other historical periods and several different cultures and also different peoples. On the other hand, the great focus on Viking Age and the Vikings and the Norse culture is mostly by those outside Scandinavia, either because they are academics who are focused on the study of a specific period and culture, or in general, people who are interested solely on a specific conception of neo-paganism and trying to find only specific motifs and cultural aspects that fit into that preconceived modern idea of a Nordic paganism. When some people only focus on a specific period and culture to try to form a cultural identity that fits into a specific modern idea of a paganism, they will find only specific elements. They will come to dead ends. They will find several limitations because they are not interested in in earlier or older periods. And as such, there won't be enough to create a strong notion of identity, which is why other modern conceptions and inventions are added over and over again to expand a culture that did not have such expansions. And thus, we end up with neo-paganisms, which deal with limited conceptions of a given historical period. And due to the lack of more cultural developments of that same specific period and culture, new and modern conceptions are added, creating an alternative reality of a culture and not an historically accurate one. And due to the fact that the Viking period had several cultural syncretisms, meaning that the Scandinavians from that period had contact with several other cultures and adding a lot of ideas from other cultures to their own culture, people start to find a lot of elements in Norse paganism that are not pagan at all, and it's understandable. And such people then refuse to accept this because they are only trying to focus on an alternative modern self-identity of a culture. So these questions concerning the existence of several different cultural ideas and cultural syncretisms in Scandinavian witchcraft, magic, and folk traditions are due to the fact that a lot of people are not actually interested in Scandinavian history, but are in fact only interested in modern preconceived ideas of a Nordic paganism, and due to pop culture mostly, only interested in modern ideas that formulate a type of neo-paganism. So my next words will help you to, I hope, not only to understand the evolution and the development of magic in Scandinavia, but also the idea of culture linked to a specific country. So I beg you to please pay close attention and to be rational, because it may be a sensitive subject to some. Very well. Archaeologically speaking, human occupation in Scandinavia points to 14,000 years ago, which means that in the field of social and human sciences, we are able to study at least 14,000 years of human development in Scandinavia. Which means it's not only the Viking period, which only constitutes roughly 3 centuries, or even only the Norse culture, so to speak, as Norse is in reference to a medieval North Germanic ethno-linguistic group. In other words, the speakers of Old Norse, a language, which is a period of language of only 5 centuries, more or less. So focusing only on a specific period doesn't actually give concrete clues about that culture, because there are several earlier and older developments. And Scandinavians are luckier than most because they only have to deal with 14,000 years of history, and as such it will be less hard, still hard, but less hard to find out the different cultures and peoples in such a time span. If we compare, of course, with, let's say, the Iberian Peninsula, with 1,400,000 years of human occupation and developments, and even more cultures, more peoples, more developments. The Iberians are in trouble because there's really a lot more cultural developments. So now comes the sensitive part. I have noticed that recently many countries are starting to adopt the idea that there is no such thing as a culture of a country. For instance, speaking of Scandinavians, quite recently there's been this idea that there's no such thing as a Norwegian culture or a Swedish culture. And this made a couple of people to speak out and create the movement "We have always been here," or "We were always here." So the idea that there's no such thing as a culture of a named country made a couple of people think that this is an attack to their culture and their people, and trying to wipe out their history and culture and memory and self-identity and cultural heritage in general. And this quickly became a case of conspiracy theory, as politicians trying to wipe out a culture or destroy a cultural identity. The truth is, and please pay close attention, and some of you try not to choke and waving your arms around. Be rational, please. It's true, there's no such thing as a Norwegian culture or a Swedish culture, or a Portuguese culture, a Spanish culture, French, Russian, Italian, English culture, etc. Because these are modern names for recent conceptions of country or nation, which with specific artificial borders, right? When we speak about cultures of the past, we cannot say they are of a country, because in the past, before the more recent formulations of nation and identity, developments of language and artificial borders, the geographical reality of the past was limitless, borderless, for hundreds of thousands of years. The Stone Age, for instance, constitutes 98% of human history, and we are speaking of a couple of million years. There were no countries. There has been several cultures, several people. People have always been on the move and in contact with each other. In fact, only quite recently, roughly 5,000 to 3,000 years ago, part of humanity became a lot more sedentary. So we are speaking of a period of history when people didn't move as much as before, but still moved quite a lot. Actually, as recent as 500 years ago, a period that only constitutes 0.5% of human history. So in prehistoric Scandinavia, no one was calling themselves as Norwegians or Swedish or Danish. The Norse were not exclusively, specifically Norwegians and Swedish or Danish. This is obvious. I don't understand the rant about we were always here. Yes, we know humanity appears in several different points, in several periods, and from that moment onwards, not only they start to develop culture, but they also interact with other peoples. And there is the inevitable natural case of not only cultural syncretism, but also syncretic ethnic identities. That's what means there's no such thing as a Norwegian culture, as an example, or a culture of another named country, because it's not only one single culture of one single people, or a recent conception of a nation with artificial fixed borders. It has been thousands, hundreds of thousands of years of several peoples and cultures. What we have nowadays is the mixture and developments of cultures. That's what a culture truly is. It is a syncretism, the amalgamation of different religions, cultures, peoples, ideas, technological developments and advancements and languages. Before the Viking Age, no one in Scandinavia was speaking Old Norse. And after the late 14th century, no one in Scandinavia was speaking Old Norse either. But after that period, it was already the development of Old Norse into something else due to cultural exchanges. This is evolution. This is why it is really, really hard to do archaeology with some people these days, and harder still to make the public understand that there is no such thing as a culture of a country, but several cultural developments, external influences and internal developments, and sending out again and coming in again over and over again. It's hard to do archaeology because when certain colleagues of mine believe that there is, let's say, Norwegian culture, they will not seek or continue to follow the development of a specific culture we are studying from a specific period beyond modern artificial borders, because they believe it's all inside the modern artificial borders. I have given an example in this channel concerning Scandinavian prehistory. Prehistoric Western Norway has more in common with Atlantic prehistoric cultures, what is now modern Portugal, northwestern Spain, Brittany, and the British Isles, more in common with those geographical areas than it has in common with other Scandinavian countries. Speaking of prehistoric times, right? So people of the past were not confined to modern ideas of artificial borders. People were on the move all the time, exchanging ideas, religions, cultures, languages, items, artifacts, and so on and so forth. And it's painful to have to explain this because, as you can see, it should be obvious. For goodness sake, even those only focused on Vikings should know perfectly well if Vikings were going all over Europe and beyond, it is obvious that they brought with them many, many cultural conceptions and peoples as well. And not only the Vikings brought with them cultures and peoples, but obviously they also brought cultures and peoples to other places, other regions. This isn't just thinking outside the box. This is literally thinking outside artificial borders that form modern nations and countries. No one is trying to destroy and wipe out a culture or an identity of a people or a cultural heritage. People need to realize that they have never been alone and that their modern cultural aspects are the product of several thousands of years of mixture of cultures, religions, and peoples, different ethnic groups. This doesn't take away the beauty of culture, it only enhances it and brings people together when they find out and realize finally that they have more in common than what they thought. Yes, you were always here, but you were never alone. In fact, what really destroys culture and the identity of a people is precisely trying to be alone, and their identity will die with them. When people try to concoct a modern self-identity as something unique and unbroken through time and move away from all the others because they fear that their identity will be destroyed, with such ideas, they are sabotaging themselves. When certain people think that survival lies in closing themselves in from the world and keep on with obsolete traditions of which they don't even truly understand or even care about or refuse to acknowledge the truth of their past, what they are doing is precisely the opposite of what they want. And so, alone, they sabotage themselves. And don't start with political rants, please. That makes me roll my eyes into the back of my head and see the universe twice. This is common sense. This is being rational. So this is why, for some people, it's hard to conceive non-Scandinavian cultural ideas and conceptions in or within Scandinavian traditional folklore. Even in relation to religious symbols, often assumed to be Viking or from the Norse religion, many religious symbols said to be Viking are either before the Viking Age and went obviously through several developments, or are after the Viking Age, and many said to be Viking symbols are not even Scandinavian. One symbol that we can clearly say that is Viking is the Volknut. The Volknut being a modern term to designate a symbol whose original name was never recorded. But the configuration of that symbol is indeed or appears in medieval Scandinavia during the Viking period, right? But there has always been several influences, external, internal, several different peoples, cultures, etc. So when some people say Norse culture, Norse culture has several thousands of years, they are saying it wrong. And I believe that's not with a bad intention. What they are trying to say or express is that there were several cultural developments and peoples that eventually led to the Norse culture. So if we are not specifically speaking of a period of 5 centuries related to the Old Norse language and are in fact referring to human occupation and cultural developments in Scandinavia, we should either say Nordic cultures, or at the very least, perhaps a little bit more specific, Scandinavian cultures. Although we have a problem when we say Nordic cultures, because there are several people in Nordic countries that are not from the same cultural, linguistic, and even ethnic background. What about the Sami, for instance, and other Finno-Ugric peoples, such as the people from Finland? Perhaps you can suggest saying Indo-European, but we can't say people from an Indo-European background either, because not only the Sami and the Finnish are not Indo-European, but also people from the Baltic, such as Estonians, are not Indo-European either. And there are several peoples, as you know it, from an Indo-European background, which are not in or from Scandinavia. So you only say Norse culture, or better still, Old Norse culture, if you are pointing to a specific period of roughly 500 years and inhabitants of Scandinavia of that period who spoke Old Norse. Or you only say Viking culture if you are specifically addressing roughly 300 years of an activity of specific persons that had a huge impact not only in the development of Scandinavian cultures, but other non-Scandinavian cultures as well. So perhaps the safest course is to say Scandinavian cultures and not Norwegian culture or Swedish culture or other very recent name for a very recent development of country or nation, when compared to the thousands of years of borderless and nationless peoples, which in the evolution of life spoke several different languages, had several different religions and systems of belief, and looked different. We, right now, are the product of such evolutions. So now we can better understand the evolution of magic and witchcraft in Scandinavia. So please, let's see. When we speak of witchcraft and magic and such, the first thing we need to interiorize is that such performances have nothing to do with religion. They may contain religious conceptions, obviously, but that the act alone doesn't require following specific religious laws, canons, rules, and doesn't have to obey to one specific religious authority. As I've pointed out on the previous video, witchcraft is a lot like animistic interactions with manifestations of powerful forces or persons in the world. Witchcraft, unlike religion, which relies on observance and theoretical approaches and considerations, witchcraft and magic, on the other hand, is highly pragmatic. It relies on experience, doing it, trying different things until it works, and what works best, we continue to do it, regardless of the contents of the incantations and the methods used. Witchcraft and activities of magical performances and ritual have a greater acceptance of different cultural ideas because it doesn't matter theoretical and philosophical conceptions and considerations. What matters in magic is the result of the activity, the final result, the intention. The aim is to create an effect, a very real and palpable effect. So in this way, folk magic is a lot more predisposed to accept several different ideas as long as it works. Folk magic is the very essence of paganism, which is why, for past pagan cultures, it was so easy to accept different cultures and share different ideas, exchange different ideas, because it gave people several different means to cause an effect, several different means to choose from to create a desirable effect in magical working. Acceptance of different folk traditions expanded choices and created a multitude of alternatives. Not to mention that precisely because of what we have previously spoken, of the several different cultural syncretisms, in time, several different ideas are merged together, creating a rich folk tradition, which is always under development. And as such, we find different approaches within witchcraft and any display of folk magic. Several deities, trickster spirits, other spirits, and a wonderful variety of ideas. Witchcraft and other displays of folk magic do not obey to religious canons and laws and to a religious authority. For as long as it works and creates the desirable effect, it's okay. It's the entire objective. So, when it comes to the evolution of Scandinavian witchcraft and magic and folk magic in general, if we take in mind what was previously said, we understand why there's such a variety of conceptions and different religious and cultural ideas in the works of magic. Of course, the earlier the period, the harder it is to remain within the living tradition and the living memory. So new ideas, recent ideas, tend to be more perceptible within the living folk traditions. So archaeologically speaking, due to the fact that in Scandinavian countries and of course other countries, megalithic structures populate the landscape, we understand through two things. First, the megalithic phenomenon was widely spread. It was very important, and hundreds of thousands of structures were raised, marking strong ideologies. Secondly, these are structures seen all over the place from afar, hard not to notice. So people continue to be attracted to them, even though such prehistoric ideologies have been almost completely forgotten. And people still go to these places and still perform works of magic in them. And due to the fact that it was an important characteristic of a period, it stays longer in the collective mind of different peoples, and certain aspects pass on to different generations. Not only this, but the fact that megalithic monuments are so widely spread all over Europe and beyond, a lot more people have contact with the same or similar ideas, which helps such ideas to survive longer by the exchange of similar conceptions between peoples, which obviously facilitates remembering. So, megalithic structures and ideologies related to such structures are perhaps the earliest conceptions surviving in works of magic. Megalithic stone structures, ancient burial mounds, sacrificial stone pits, and other similar cultural developments still make an important presence in works of magic, witchcraft, sorcery. So it's no coincidence that in Scandinavian folk magic, these structures, these monuments, also make an important appearance in several methods and activities of Scandinavian folk magic, folk tradition. So over a millennia, until our modern times, these ancient sites have been associated with local legends of entities we often see either in folklore or mythology. Nowadays, marginalized as simply being fantastical creatures of folklore and mythology. But such creatures are very real, and they belong to an animistic worldview, as I've pointed out on the video concerning animism and the others and the ancestors. These are entities and spirits that an interaction with is possible, a symbiotic relationship to acquire power and manifestations of forces for the work of magic. Invocation of certain spirits to aid in the work of magic. Because, as I've said, witchcraft, magic, trolldom is highly pragmatic. So it isn't something to be astonished by when in Scandinavian folk magic there's often the necessity to do a specific practical work towards certain spirits and entities linked to ancient stone structures, such as the elves, trolls, giants. Thus, we find many folk tales and local legends of trolls and giants and elven kings associated to such ancient structures. And these local legends and folk tales are crucial not only to understand a more animistic past and way of thinking, obviously, but also to understand certain performances in magic. The contact with trolls, elves, with the dead, with ancestral beings, and so on and so forth. Such ancient sites become sacred, and this sacredness becomes a vital part of the community, which from time to time, even nowadays, we still find someone in there performing some ritual procedure around these sites. And other places such as churches, graveyards, cemeteries, crossroads, specific rocks and trees. This indicates several different periods of several different cultures and mentalities and what was understood to be sacred to each, which ends up in an amalgamation of ideas surviving in folk tradition. So it's small wonder in practices of magic the contact with such places and structures and geographical features as well. They are understood to be sacred or containing power or inhabited by powerful and or magical entities which aid in the performances of magic. This is all still part of the living tradition. Raising the trolls, the elvor, fairies or elves, ancestors and other spirits of the dead, and invocations of ancient gods such as Odin and Freyja, as being the gods related to death, which aid in the contact with the dead, but also calling upon other entities and gods from other cultures which have made their presence and became strong symbols absorbed by the interactions with other peoples and the adoption of other cultures. For instance, in Scandinavian folk magic, it often appears the invocation of Odin, the Norse god Odin, to contact with the dead, but also invocation of Christ at the same time and his disciples and God and the Virgin Mary to obtain protection in the performance, and even the devil to obtain power or aid, or at the same time conjuring an entity with an hazel branch, creating with it symbols on the ground, symbols of pentagrams, crosses, runes, a great mixture, and the use of spoken words, incantations called troll formulas, magical incantations to aid in the entire performance and call upon something. I've given an example of such a troll formula, troll formel. I believe it was in the video concerning uti seta. Troll formulas, spoken words or written words, which serve as spells, enchantments, or incantations. There are more than 50,000 troll formulas that have survived and have been collected in Sweden alone. And the one example I have given on that video, I'll put it in here on the screen, and I'll put it in Swedish in the description of this video. But you will see the words to wake up. It is a performance to wake up a dead body, from whom knowledge and prophecy is to be acquired. And you will see the invocation of Jesus, the Virgin Mary, and the apostles. But attached to this troll formula also comes an ancient pagan performance, or similarities with uti seta or sitya uti, sitting outside. And other more recent performances, such as the use of the dirt from the grave, and with the other hand, an hazel branch cut on a specific day, usually on Thursday, the chosen day to perform magic related to the god Thor, Thor's day. So you see the amalgamation of different ideas. Folk magic is a rich living tradition which is the product of several historical cultural developments. A couple of historians and archaeologists to this day still try to reinforce the idea that the Nordic countries are isolated regions where long-standing and long-lasting customs are shared by all the inhabitants. Because of this, much of Scandinavian cultures are actually neglected, and also their people and different traditions. Many cultural aspects are put aside and end up being forgotten. As I said, focusing only on what we want to be real is precisely how we lose our own cultures because we refuse to acknowledge the other realities that do not fit into what we want to be real. One of the most important factors that led to a constant contact with other peoples from the part of Nordic peoples was the amber trading routes, reaching Scandinavia down to the Mediterranean. And such routes were widely traveled as early as 6,000 years ago. Many graves of Nordic peoples are found in both Spain and Portugal, dating to the early Neolithic. And what about the Bronze Age Minoan stone carvings in Scandinavia, especially in Norway, along the coast, and the letters from the Greek alphabet, and the runes themselves, the oldest runic or the earliest runic symbols are found in northern Portugal. And the cup marks and the ring marks, as well as the prehistoric rock carvings of elks, stags, and deer, so similar to each other along the Atlantic and northwestern Norway. And the old trading town of Ergo in Sweden, where a small Buddha statuette from North India and a christening scoop from Egypt, both dating from the 5th century, were found in there, in a sacred grove. So not a question of raiding and taking away valuable items, because such items were carefully placed on a sacred grove in Sweden. Foreigner sacred items that remained sacred in Sweden. And during the Scandinavian Bronze Age, there was constant travel from northern to southern Europe, evidenced both in trade goods and stone carvings. The megalithic ritual structures in the form of huge boats show that travel by sea was important quite early. And roughly 6,000 years ago, the funnel beaker culture arrived in Scandinavia, which influenced those people into creating massive megalithic grave monuments and adopting new ritual structures. And roughly 4,800 years ago, the people of the battle axe culture, a branch of the corded ware culture, living side by side with the funnel beaker people, and the bell beaker culture originating in Western Atlantic Iberia, expanding into the rest of Europe, eventually influencing the cultures of the British Isles and Central European cultures, eventually influencing Scandinavians as well. And the exchange of cultures and of peoples. And I'm not even going into details about the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim graves of the Middle Ages found in Scandinavia, because some of you are still too sensitive about it. But as you can see, there are plenty of examples of cultural exchanges and developments and different peoples coming together. I mean, it's safe to say that the northern regions of Europe were not at all isolated from the rest of the continent or even other parts of the world. And this is important to mention because, along with trading routes and several cultural exchanges and mixtures of peoples, many traditions and magical performances, methods and rituals, and all sorts of things were both imported and exported. Scandinavian peoples throughout history have given and have received, have adopted and have taken and have delivered. Like everybody else, Scandinavians have been far from isolated. Many still think that the process of globalization is a modern thing, but it isn't. It's just made easier nowadays due to technological advancements. People have always wanted to be in contact with each other and exchange ideas and traditions and culture in general. These interactions and exchanges only became a problem quite recently with the growing xenophobic and racist political propagandas of political parties that hold on to extreme traditionalist ideas. And it's those political parties and ideas that actually destroy culture, because isolation destroys identity. As I said before, the oldest traces of human activity in Scandinavian regions date us back to 14,000 years ago. And we continue to see large numbers of human groups constantly migrating due north, continuously in a span of at least 6,000 years. 6,000 years of moving northwards constantly is a very long time, which certainly left religious traces. Maybe this is one of the reasons why in Norse mythology the realm of the dead is to the north, and the souls of the dead always moving north to reach the afterlife. And in the entrances of grave mounds and megalithic structures related to the dead, oriented north and northwestwards, or the bodies themselves of the deceased oriented northwards. And in Scandinavian folk magical traditions, to this day, many performances related to the dead and contacting with the dead or the spirits of the afterlife is always facing north. The roots of Scandinavian folk magic can be found in the several historical layers of cultural developments and, of course, religious developments from all over Europe and many other places from outside Europe. Take the example of the plants, herbs, and roots, medicinal folk practice of Scandinavia, which is the exact same thing as medicinal practices of the Mediterranean and of the Middle East. Ideas, practices, performances spread by monks, priests, clergymen, external influences, but also to these same performances of other countries, very real Scandinavian ritualistic performances were also added. Exchange of practices, and most importantly, exchange of knowledge about practical ritualistic behavior and methods, utensils, and materials. And all these exchanges became part of the Trolldom tradition, witchcraft and magic, folk magic. So it's very important to always take this in mind. A living folk magic tradition is always taking in impressions from outside, but certain traits of the tradition remain distinguishable. Some things change and others remain the same. But it's always a rich, living tradition, always moving, always evolving, developing, always adapting in order to survive. And it's not just influences of past cultures. Folk magic is still under development right in front of our eyes, right now at this very moment. Since more or less the 1960s, Scandinavia has seen a rise on spiritual practices. The rise of neo-paganism, which is quite curious because the neo-pagan communities in Scandinavia have incorporated into folk magic a diversity of influences from core shamanism, from the American anthropologist Michael Harner, and also a lot of influences from the English magical religion called Wicca, mixing this together with old native Scandinavian methods and techniques of the folk magic tradition. Not to mention the large amounts of immigrants from former Eastern countries in Europe and also from Arab cultures from around the Middle East, and the growing immigrants from Thailand, Nigeria, and Ghana, who have also brought into Scandinavia their own cultures and folk traditions, and this has been added to the Scandinavian folk magic. There is an increasing in voodoo practices in Scandinavia as well. It continues to evolve, and people do it because they have more alternatives so that the desirable effects of the folk magic from their practices can truly be successful. And if you think this is destroying Scandinavian culture, you are wrong, and you would be very much surprised with the reality, because you are only focusing on the immigrations and the cultures that are brought in. The truth is, immigrants not only bring, obviously, their own culture, but they also adopt the culture of the countries they are coming to live in. Scandinavian cultures are being adopted by immigrants just as quickly as the cultures of the immigrants are being adopted by the Scandinavians themselves, as it has always been throughout history, as I have previously mentioned with several examples. And let's not forget that Scandinavian cultures have also been the focus of interest from other peoples and cultures outside Scandinavia, people who are not even Scandinavian. There's a growing development of Scandinavian folk traditions, magic, religions, and myths in Latin America and also Asian countries. For goodness sake, even the royal families of Scandinavian countries show a continuous spiritual interest since at least the early 18th century, and they are practicing a variety of folk traditions and spiritualities from different places of the world, and not Scandinavian actually. Culture is made through contact with different peoples. A culture will not be forgotten or destroyed by the exchange of ideas and contact with different peoples and traditions. A culture is destroyed by being isolated and ignored. So remember that. Or, of course, a culture is destroyed if a country starts a process of colonization and forces other people to accept a single type of religion, and all the native cultural factors are subjugated to the new religious and political law and authority. And indeed, a culture and an identity of a people will be wiped out with the help of genocide. But that's not happening anymore, not on a global scale. People nowadays are more interested in understanding other points of view and have contact with different traditions, because not only it's exotic, but it is exciting, and people hunger for knowledge. It's precisely due to the late growing interest in spirituality that is leading people to explore more, exchange more ideas. The rise of spiritual practices and activities and the decline of Christianity in the Western world and other such religious activities is opening up a new horizon, and it is making it possible for several different cultures to survive and to emerge again because of the adoption and exchange of cultures, as it has always been in the past, as I've previously demonstrated. And this factor is a lot more noticeable in traditional folk magical practices, which is always under development. As I said before, and I repeat, folk magic is a rich living tradition which is the product of several historical cultural developments. So with this video and all that was said in here, I can now delve into more detailed videos concerning Scandinavian folk magic and Trolldom, because now it will be easier to understand the reason why Scandinavian folk magic, like any folk magical traditions of every other place, is filled with different cultural aspects. So I do hope you have enjoyed this video. I hope it was useful and a mind opener. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today.